covering an area that's not necessarily covered in your textbook, but I think it's something that's important in the context of this class, and that's the professional and social responsibilities of scientists. So in this class, the assumption is that you're learning the basics of how research is applied in psychology. And some of you will go on to have careers that we more traditionally would refer to as scientists, but all of you are going to operate in a world where you're called upon to evaluate science, to be able to be a consumer, and hopefully to be a smart consumer of science and a critical one. So all of the principles we associate with being scientists, I think, can be applied into how we consume and evaluate science. But this is really the issues that are specific to being a practitioner in the scientific field, or specifically in psychology to a certain extent. So let's talk about some details entailed in here. So when we think about malpractice in research, we almost always think about, medical doctors. Psychologists certainly have to be mindful of malpractice issues, though not nearly to the extent that physicians are. But we forget that, there is malpractice within the research field as well. There's this image, this sort of, putting scientists on a pedestal at times to portray them as these seekers of truth without any subjectivity or self-interest, and that's just not normal. It's not, how people normally operate. I think it's important to just identify and be mindful of the fact that the average scientist is no morally different from the average person, that there are dimensions and degrees of all characteristics within the individuals that pursue science. It's just that there's certain applications and certain relevant things that have to be considered in science regarding that person's morality. So there are ways to conduct malpractice, but I think it's wishful thinking, and it's a way of being exceptionalist, I think, to believe that scientists have no vested interest, or that they're completely objective, or that they always strive for some degree of that. We have a lot of biases, as we've discussed throughout this class, and those biases include a belief that your data is more representative somehow of the truth than the data of others. We have that natural tendency to focus more on our own experiences rather than those of others. So we trust ourselves sometimes more than we trust others to be strenuous and rigorous in their application of science. There's all kinds of biases that enter into our thinking to make us believe that we have a better handle on quote unquote the truth, or something resembling the truth, compared to others. Remember this concept from the very first couple of lectures, where we watched the video from Jay Bernowski from the Ascent of Man series that was made by the BBC. That entire episode 10 of that series, is about our tolerance for uncertainty in science. We must always be mindful of hubris, right? Hubris is, from the sort of Greek and Latin derivatives, hubris is the idea that pride goeth before the fall, so to speak. Hubris is to believe that we're infallible, which, the Greek tragedians, people like Aeschylus and Euripides and Sophocles, they wrote a lot about people who thought that they were infallible, or that they somehow rose to the level or power of the gods, and therefore they had this fall that went along with their hubris, whether it was Oedipus or Aeneas, whoever it is. So this happens to be something that we have to be aware of in psychology and in the practice of science in general. We have to always remain in the mindset that we are never going to represent absolute truth, that there is always an approximation going on, that there's always some degree of bias or error inherent in our work, and we have to accept and tolerate a certain degree of uncertainty. Whenever we are trying to understand something, we're never finished seeking the truth or approximating the truth in science. It is an ongoing, iterative process that is constantly being evaluated and adjusted, and is evolving in a certain sense. So when we talk about scientific malpractice in the context of research and psychological research, it's synonymous with fraud or dishonesty. It's misrepresenting yourself or the truth or your data and being dishonest about it. And we're going to talk about some ways in which that happens, practically speaking, and how that's applied. So these are the four basic ways in which we can commit scientific malpractice as it relates to presenting or representing our data. That's data forging, data cooking, data trimming, and data torturing. These are all various ways in which we're being fraudulent or dishonest in how we're working with or presenting our data. And I'll go into each of them in a little bit of detail. So data forging is when you invent data out of whole cloth, when you basically just make up data that's not based on any experiment that was ever actually conducted. So it's the sort of most extreme example of scientific malpractice in regards to data. It's when you completely just make stuff up. There's an example that I want to point to, and that's the example of Stephen Bruning. Stephen Bruning was a well-respected professor and researcher, and he was fabricating results regarding the dangers of the use of sedatives to treat self-injuring mentally retarded children. He claimed so there's a practice with people with mental retardation who engage in self-injuring behavior, which unfortunately is not entirely rare within that particular disability. And so there was a tendency in individuals with more severe instances of self-injuring to utilize medications like the benzodiazepine class, which is a sedative dose of medications. And these were being even used with children who had extreme severe behavior. Now, there is a cascade of other interventions that are supposed to take place first before sedatives or medications are utilized, but those of you who have worked in an inpatient psychiatric hospital or in that setting know that there are some people where medication is a last resort to keep them from harming themselves or someone else. It's not the stereotype that we think of, or the old-fashioned version like cuckoo's nest, but certainly they still utilize sedatives in psychiatric settings on occasion. Um, anyway, that practice was something that Stephen Bruning was very critical of, and he, purported that sedatives were harmful. And in doing so, he claimed that cessation, led to an increase in IQ. What he was essentially saying was that sedatives were diminishing the intellectual functioning of these individuals, that it was, impairing them to the extent that they were performing worse on cognitive tests or tests of mental facility, and claimed that when you stopped using them, people's testable IQ increased. Okay. However, he had entirely fabricated the results regarding the efficacy of stimulants to improve this behavior. So he had a counter argument. In the attention deficit hyperactivity disorder world of clinical psychology, as I'm sure you're all well aware, there's a long-standing tradition of utilizing stimulants to treat attention deficit and hyperactivity. It has what's called a paradoxical effect. Despite it being a stimulant, it often will help some individuals to concentrate, slow down, focus. Okay. He was in favor of utilizing stimulants to improve this behavior amongst individuals with mental retardation, and he fabricated data to this effect, which led to some states to change their policy about which medications were utilized in their state facilities, or what was legal to be used, or within policy in private facilities within that state. It was some time later, when he was a well-respected researcher within this area, that it came to light that he had entirely fabricated his data. So this is a really glaring example. The other most important example, which I think potentially as far as scientific malpractice of the last few decades goes, I believe that Dr. Andrew Wakefield might take the cake as history's greatest monster in this particular area. So Andrew Wakefield is a former physician, English physician. He has since lost his medical license and is no longer allowed to practice. In fact, his medical school, I believe, retracted his MD. Anyway, he was a researcher in the area of autism. And Andrew Wakefield published a study in the Lancet, which is a very, very reputable medical journal out of Great Britain, in 1998. And in that article, he presented data claiming that he had scientific evidence that the bundled measles, mumps, rubella vaccine that was given to children, which had been a practice for many years, led to increased rates of autism. This is ground zero for the anti-vaccination movement that plagues us today, unfortunately. And we're seeing a new wrinkle in this issue. I mean, we certainly were seeing things like outbreaks of scarlet fever and mumps in places where they had been entirely eradicated. And unfortunately, in places that were, often very wealthy places, high socioeconomic status, because of the anti-vaccination movement. Which is really misinformation spread mostly through the internet about vaccines causing a whole host of problems. And this ranges from things like, feasible things, like the idea that perhaps there was some way in which a vaccine could increase the rates of autism, all the way up to, full-blown conspiracy theories about vaccines, that they include tracking chips from Bill Gates and such. In the middle of, in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, the anti-vaccination movement takes on a much more dangerous potential, and that is the idea of discouraging people from taking one of the many effective COVID-19 vaccines that are available. So Andrew Wakefield's sort of drop into the pond created massive ripple effects that plague us to this day, despite the fact that in 2010, The Lancet, after an internal investigation and the work of some good journalists, discovered that Dr. Andrew Wakefield had completely fabricated his data, that his data was completely made up. Not just that, but that his scientific practices were woefully out of line. When he did actually conduct research, he was doing some very questionable things regarding informed consent, regarding how he was gathering data, and in some cases just completely fabricating data out of whole cloth. So he was sort of, obviously, he'd become a very, very loud voice in the world of anti-vaccination. He garners, large payments for his presence to speak at various conferences and organizations. As I said, he lost his medical license and I believe his medical degree and is not allowed to practice anymore. But even after the retraction in 2010, which was rare in the Lancet to come out and not just say we have concerns, but to literally say we are retracting this study as if we had never published it due to these issues. It's just one example of what happens when scientific malpractice sort of is disseminated out into the public sphere, and it has really serious impact. It causes, it has the potential to kill people and to cause really serious public health issues. The other thing that I think is important to remember about Andrew Wakefield and how this relates to sort of the current circumstances is that he was essentially fabricating data completely, but also, as I said, doing some things that were really questionable in terms of informed consent. The afterword to this story that I think is really important, if you kind of want to get into the motivation of why people conduct scientific malpractice, we'll talk about it in a minute, but I think that Andrew Wakefield's story is an important anecdote in this area. So Andrew Wakefield proposed that it was the bundling of the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine that led to autism. He was saying that bombarding the delicate immune systems of children with all of these vaccines at once is problematic. So he was not, even in his own writings, he was not entirely anti-vaccination. He was anti-bundling of the MMR vaccine. It came to light years later that Dr. Andrew Wakefield, prior to the publication of his article in 1998, had applied for a patent for a single measles vaccine. Essentially, he had patented or applied for a patent for a vaccine that delivered just the measles vaccine in the absence of the mumps and rubella vaccine, which at the time there was really no market for, there was no demand for because the MMR was so common. Of course, you don't have to look too hard to connect the dots to see that Andrew Wakefield was in a position to gain a lot of financial windfall if all of a sudden there was demand for a single measles vaccine for children. So his motivations became clear over time, and we really saw that it was nothing more than sort of an attempt to seek fame and to seek fortune. So if you're not data forging, if you're not just creating data completely out of nowhere, what are some other ways in which we do this? I think that data cooking is perhaps the second most common. Let me just tighten this up here. This is where you, the term cooking is because in the process of looking at the data, you are manipulating it. So this is when you discard data that does not support your study's hypothesis, so the study produces better results. Okay. The idea then is that you look to individual examples that don't show the relationship between the independent and dependent variable, for example, or don't show a strong correlation. You determine that if I discard that data and run the analysis just on the ones that I've selected, then I can end up with a more favorable result. It is only ethical to remove data from your study when there's evidence that it's invalid. And let's talk about that. If the researcher, the person that you've recruited to help you with your study, doesn't calibrate the machinery, if this apparatus, whatever it is, if they don't administer the questionnaire correctly, if they say something to the participant that they're not supposed to say that reveals the intent of the study in a study that involves some form of deception, if you have some reason to believe that the data that was delivered to the study is invalid, was poorly gathered, and therefore not really shouldn't be considered in the total data set, then you can discard it and you document that within your paper and within your own records. Another form of scientific malpractice is data trimming. This is where you are keeping particular sets of data or individual points of data, but you're changing the values so they better fit the predictions made by your research hypothesis. So you're not throwing it out in the way that you do in cooking, but rather you're trimming it to make it fit within parameters that gives you statistical results that are more in your favor. Another example from history is someone named Sir Cyril Burt. He was a very reputable researcher in the field of intelligence and IQ testing, and it was discovered posthumously after he had died that he had both trimmed and forged data to better fit his theory of IQ. The interesting thing is that while he was alive, people were sometimes critical of his data, but it was after his death that some researchers took a really hard look at it, and what they found was that his results were too good to be true. The reason why is that when you dig into the data and you start investigating and doing sort of forensic statistical analysis, what you find is that there is not the normal amount of variance expected in his data from study to study. The data looks too good. It does not reflect the normal distribution of how people score on measures, and so it didn't seem to have enough variability. It fit the parameters too perfectly, and that was what led people to look even closer and go back and look at his original files, and they eventually discovered that he had been doing both data forging and data trimming in his reporting. The final one is called data torturing, which might be a little bit hyperbolic, but essentially what data torturing implies is when you are improperly applying statistical tests. We talked before about why we don't conduct 25 independent t-tests. Rather, we run an ANOVA if we have a lot of different groups or conditions of our independent variables. The more tests conducted, the more likely you're going to find a statistically significant finding. The more you look, the more you examine, eventually you will often find something statistically significant. The problem is, every time you increase the number of tests you're doing, you're increasing the possibility of a type 1 error. You're increasing the likelihood that you will reject the null hypothesis when in fact it was just due to chance. So data torturing is when you sometimes you have a data set, you have your analysis plan in place, you run your analyses, and it turns out none of your hypotheses are really supported by the data. So then you decide, well, I'll split the data up this way. Like maybe if I throw out people that are above a certain age or that have a certain characteristic, maybe I'll get a better result, which is not necessarily by itself an unethical thing to do. It can be a post hoc analysis that makes sense. But when you do that over and over and over, and you continue to split and manipulate and change the data and run different types of analyses, you're just going to continually sit here and they call it torturing because you're just doing it over and over and over until you find something reportable, something statistically significant. What you've done in the process is greatly increase the likelihood that you're committing a type 1 error, that you are improperly rejecting the null hypothesis. So we run into problems of all 4 types within scientific malpractice in psychology. So what's the extent of the problem? How bad is this? We don't know. It's very difficult to estimate the degree of scientific malpractice. There is a certain trust that we place in one another as practitioners of science. When I submit a manuscript to a peer-reviewed journal, they may look at it with a skeptical eye and look for red flags that are clear evidence of things like data forging, data torturing, data trimming. But there is a certain amount of assumption on the part of the reader, on the part of the peer reviewer, on the part of the journal, on the part of everyone, that you are sticking to that important ethical principle of integrity that we've discussed way back in the early chapters. So it's very difficult because a lot of that stuff happens behind closed doors. It's in the conduct of the research and the analysis and then the writing of it, which is all essentially done for the most part privately. Within small groups of people at the very least, and we have to take it at face value that it's being presented accurately and that it's not being manipulated or at least intentionally being misrepresented. We are seeing increasing reports of scientific malpractice within the field of psychology since the mid-1970s. That does not mean that it's more frequent. I think what it means is that we are more aware of it, we are perhaps more stringent, and we are looking for it a little harder. Um, there is there are a few systems in place that help with this. If you are receiving funding from a federal agency and sometimes from state agencies as well, there's congressional oversight in that funding, or local government or state government oversight. They often want to see what their money is getting, and they will sometimes go through it with a finer tooth comb, looking at your data than just a university, perhaps. If you are receiving funding of that nature, you have to sort of account for what you've done, and it also increases the potential criminal repercussions if you do commit scientific malpractice, because you can also be charged with misuse of government funds, as opposed to just the outcome of losing a job or having a sort of a negative reputation. There could be actual criminal charges associated with it. The peer review process is really the first line of defense, and that's why there's things that researchers who are reviewers for journals, who are the peers in the peer review process, they will look for things like examples like Sir Cyril Burt's data that just looks too good to be true. It's just too perfect. They will look for inconsistencies within the manuscript that just don't seem to make sense, or if the person reports a rather obscure or very specific finding that's not really related to the originally proposed hypotheses or analysis plan, that might raise some eyebrows and have the person say, wait a minute, how did they arrive at this particular statistical test? It doesn't logically make sense. And then the assumption might become they've run a lot of tests to get here, and therefore they might be guilty of, intentionally or otherwise, data torturing of some type. So what are the motivations for scientific malpractice? We talked about Dr. Andrew Wakefield, who had obviously, a secondary gain idea of, if I basically scare people that the MMR bundled vaccine is causing their children to have a higher rate of autism, or in fact literally causing autism, which was really his claim, then I could make a lot of money off of my single measles vaccine, right? He also Andrew Wakefield very much put himself out there in sort of the media landscape. He presented himself publicly in multiple places and platforms as an expert, and continues to do so to a certain extent. Um, so we often want to look at personal factors, right? We want to assume that the individual that would do this, the deviant scientist as it were, has some mental aberration or disorder. And that's not entirely untrue in some cases. We don't want to discount the possibility of things like cluster B personality disorders. For those of you that are unfamiliar, within the diagnostic manual and within the world of psychology and psychiatry, of clinical psychology and psychiatry, there is a subset of disorders that are called personality disorders. These are more pervasive, long-standing, largely unchangeable, unchanged for the most part, patterns of behavior that almost always involve interpersonal interaction to some degree or another. There's a whole host of different types, but there is a group of them called the cluster B personality disorders. This includes borderline personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, and antisocial personality disorder, aka psychopathy. If you hear someone referred to as a psychopath, usually clinically what's implied by that is that they meet the diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder. All four of these personality disorders are more highly correlated with fraud, misrepresentation, those types of things. So there are some people within the scientific world who would meet the diagnostic criteria for these full-blown personality disorders, and they're going to lie, cheat, and steal to self-aggrandize, for gain, because the rules don't apply to them, because they're narcissistic or whatever it is, to get attention, whatever the motivation is. There are people that we can argue are dimensionally sort of out at the end of the bell curve as far as their degree of pathology. However, I think that's convenient. I think that's something that we do to make ourselves feel better. Certainly those are some isolated cases that I would not question that at all. But there are some people that commit fraud and scientific malpractice that I don't think would necessarily fit into those categories. So we need to be careful that we are not overly pathologizing or making this out to be something that only happens to abnormal individuals, that they do this. This is the most common excuse given when people, are committing fraud, when they get caught, they will often claim to be, mentally unstable. They'll say, I was under so much pressure, the publish or perish academic world that I was in. I felt I didn't have any choice but to do something fraudulent. This is the excuse most commonly given when someone is caught. We can also do this in a way that is less deliberate. We're going to talk about that in a minute, but it often stems from a lack of objectivity. As I said, we have a personal bias to believe that our data is a better representation of the truth than others. It's just the nature of normal human egoism. We see the world through our perspective. We are always, to one degree or another, implicitly or explicitly biased regarding ourselves versus others. It's just the nature of the way consciousness works, and we all suffer with this disease to some degree or another. We are not objective, right? We try and we strive to be, and we make efforts to be, but we know there is always some degree of subjectivity. When that is out of hand, I think we have a tendency to say, I just think I'm right. I believe in this theory enough that I start to correct the data to fit the theory. I'm committing a cardinal sin within the Church of Science, right? I'm saying that my intuition is more important, my common knowing is more important than what the data is telling me. And that's when we really lost our objectivity to an extreme. Outside of personal factors that might motivate someone, keeping in mind, in an academic world, it is, their publish or perish is a cliche for a reason. If you are pursuing tenure as a researcher, if you want to be respected by your peers, you need publications. Publications with interesting or supportive data are more likely to get published than articles that are submitted where you didn't find what you were looking for. That's just a fact. So there is a subtle problem, not just within individuals, but also within institutions. Okay. So these are institutional factors that might perhaps enable or influence someone's likelihood to conduct scientific malpractice. So professional schools, especially medical schools, tend to foster a spirit of competition rather than collaboration among students. There's still a culture in a lot of places to be the best of the best, to be the best and brightest amongst your already selective group of peers. As I said, successful research is rewarded. If you don't support your hypotheses, we have a tendency to think of that as a failure, which I think is, again, dropping the ball in regards to how empiricism and science are supposed to work. Nevertheless, we can't help but sometimes take it personally, and we can't help but feel like we've failed in some way when we don't find supporting data. Some research is quite expensive to conduct. It costs a lot of time and a lot of money. And if you are conducting expensive research that's not finding anything or not supporting your theories, you start to worry that, am I going to get further funding? Often the next grant, the next source of funding is contingent upon your continued success. So if you're not performing, and when we define it institutionally, when we define performing as finding statistically significant support for your theory, then what happens is you're worried about your funding resources being cut off, and that's not greedy. That is just the nature of the beast. Without funding of one form or another, unless you're independently wealthy, it's very difficult to conduct research. A lot of our financial and professional success is tied to successful research, raises, tenure, speaking and consulting fees, awards, all of these things. And the other issue is that if you have a large-scale study that requires you to train and enlist a lot of quote-unquote hired hands, whether those are graduate students or volunteers or employees, perhaps they're not as committed to scientific vigor as the researcher might be. They may see their job as being dependent upon providing their employer with favorable results. That might be due to getting that message directly from the employer, or it might just be the way that they perceive it. You can be perfectly ethical as the researcher, and you might have a person helping to conduct your research who just feels obligated to give you good news. That's because of their own particular way of thinking. So you have people out there who are conducting research who may or may not have the same ethical principles and may have some sort of implicit or explicit motivation to manipulate data and conduct fraud on your behalf. So if we concede to one degree or another that scientific malpractice is happening, is out there in this world of scientific research, How do we detect it? How do we enforce it? And there are a lot of problems with this. It is difficult. As I said, so much of the action takes place behind closed doors. Incidents of malpractice and fraud are extremely difficult to detect for a variety of reasons. Others may be reluctant to take action when they suspect that it's occurring for a variety of reasons. So first and foremost, maybe the threshold for us is extremely high because we don't want to falsely accuse someone, so we might ignore a lot of red flags because there's not concrete evidence. But let's start with the detection phase. So we've talked about how there is a replication crisis within psychology, right? That full replication is notably absent in behavioral sciences, and therefore that can't really serve as a poor detector of malpractice. So someone presents a study, that study's published, someone tries to replicate that study, maybe multiple people try to replicate the study, don't get similar results. Well, we already know there's a problem with type 1 error within psychology and within the behavioral sciences, so that in and of itself is not evidence of malpractice. Um, Suspicious data is usually where we start. As I said, Cyril Burt, he had this data that was just perfect. It just looked too good to be true. The same was kind of true of Andrew Wakefield's studies. The practical significance he was finding between these groups, between the levels of autism, was really high. Um, it's often difficult to prove or disprove because the evidence is often ambiguous. As I said, people want to be sure before they make a really serious accusation. For that reason, enforcement becomes a problem. Some scientists are very reluctant to accuse a peer of fraud. I'm not saying that it's like a snitches get stitches world, obviously, but it has very serious repercussions. And when you start to accuse a person whose entire career is based upon conducting scientific research, getting tenure, pursuing an academic career within it, what is essentially a relatively close-knit world, that's a really serious, there's a lot of really serious implications for that accusation. So people are reluctant. Administrations at institutions are rarely willing to conduct proper investigations. This is due to the optics of it. They're concerned about the reputation of their institution. They're concerned about future funding. If it becomes clear that their institution is associated with fraud or scientific malpractice, is that going to leave a bad taste in the mouth of funding agencies and those that have the means to give money to institutions? Are they going to say, is that place where it got busted for doing blah, blah, blah? Well, you don't want those optics out there if you're the administration of a university, for example. Government agencies are not immune. Obviously, this happens in research conducted in government agencies as well. Punishments are unlikely to be severe. So if you are a believer in the idea of deterrence, there's mixed feelings about deterrence as an effective strategy for changing people's behavior. I kind of wrote a whole master's thesis about it regarding drug policy. But within the scientific world, if you are caught, but you're caught in a way that's ambiguous, or it's swept under the rug, there's often not severe punishments unless it's something extremely blatant or it's repetitive. There is also within universities not always the levels of whistleblower protection that there is, say, for example, in the federal government. There's concern that you yourself might be punished by virtue of reporting this in subtle or explicit ways. This all raises one very important question. Qui custodiet ipsos custodes, right? This is what Cicero, the Roman orator, said when the Praetorian Guard was accused of corruption. So the Praetorian Guard was the elite aspect of the Roman army that served as the personal bodyguards for the emperor. They were sort of the best of the best, supposed to be the greatest, the strongest fighters, but also the most upstanding, reputable individuals within that sort of aspect of the Roman society. They were thought to be above reproach, and when they were accused of corruption, Cicero made this statement, which in Latin translates to English, of who watches the watchman. For those of you that are fans of Alan Moore and his comic book series that was subsequently turned into movies and TV shows, The Watchmen, this is a phrase that's repeated many times. Who is paying attention to those that are sort of responsible for creating their own industry? So where is the oversight within science? As I said, science is by its nature often a pretty solitary pursuit. A lot of this happens behind closed doors, sometimes just one individual really having access to the data. It requires development of a moral code of integrity that eschews dishonesty in research. That goes all the way back to the beginning of this class when we talked about scientific principles in research. And integrity is one of those 5 major principles drawn from the APA's code of conduct. So you have to really focus early in the career of scientists, and then you have to maintain a strong moral sense within the community. So you will receive ethics training if you pursue graduate school in psychology. It's a part of of your um, your career path. If you become a professional, you'll often be required to take ethics courses as part of continuing education. Clinicians certainly have to do this every year, and I think researchers do as well through the university. So we have an obligation to educate and then continue to educate people about ethical professional behavior in science, and that's a really important thing we can do to try and cut down on scientific malpractice. It's not going to dissuade everybody, especially maybe people that are further out in that pathology of personality, but it certainly is going to cut down significantly on sort of unintentional or implicit problems within research in terms of fraud that's not really intended but happens for reasons of ignorance or misunderstanding. So that's what I want to talk about next, which is there are mistakes and errors in research that are not intentional per se. They're not deliberate, but they still constitute a misrepresentation of data. Um, so we know that malpractice in research can cause harm. We also know that poorly conducted research can cause harm. Even if you are going in with the best intentions, there are ways in which you are inadvertently committing scientific malpractice. So we have an ethical obligation as researchers to conduct valid research. We acknowledge the possibility of mistakes. That's part of our tolerance for uncertainty. We know it is sort of ingrained within the statistics, within the theory surrounding null hypothesis significance testing. It's acknowledging there is a chance that what I am seeing here is entirely just due to random error. It's just due to the chance of how these people randomly got assigned a condition. We acknowledge that, which is why we set things like p-values and alpha levels, right, of 0.05. We talk about type 1 and type 2 errors. We are acknowledging and being mindful of the possibility for making mistakes. So scientific rigor is an attempt to minimize honest mistakes. If we are rigorous in our application of scientific principles, we are going to decrease the likelihood of a mistake. We are also going to hopefully decrease the chance that we are introducing bias inadvertently, and we're going to just be honest about the fact that there may be error involved, but we're going to do our best to minimize it. We need to distinguish blameless mistakes from culpable error. There is an important distinct difference within the world of research. People need to feel comfortable acknowledging and correcting innocent, we'll call them innocent or blameless mistakes, unintentional mistakes, as opposed to intentional fraud. If we have a culture within science that allows for that, it is going to help with the self-correcting process. We're going to get better scientific findings as a result of this. So how does error negatively influence the world? How does it affect people in a negative way? So these are some major areas in which there's major consequences of error in research. First of all, there is harm to the research participants. Okay. In a very sort of baseline level, we are wasting their time. Maybe our study involves putting them through some degree of discomfort. If we go back to Milgram's study, even though he didn't find any evidence of any significant harm, we can all argue, well, there was potential, right? Putting them through even just an uncomfortable situation if you are making a major error in your research is a form of harm. It's a form of waste. It's a form of time theft, if you will. Properly designed but poorly executed research could lead to direct harm if careless researchers fail to implement necessary safety procedures, right? If we don't calibrate the equipment properly, people could get hurt. So it can be direct and it can be more subtle. In a more abstract sense, in a more conceptual way, errors in research harms science. It gives us worse science, less valid science. The results of poor research may end up published, and they end up in the scientific literature, and they harm our search for knowledge. They muddy the waters. They misdirect the potential efforts of subsequent researchers, and it is very difficult to purge that erroneous research from the body of knowledge. We talked about the Lancet publishing their retraction of Andrew Wakefield's 1998 study, but retractions are rare. I believe that was the first time in its many, many, many year history, starts in the 19th century, that the Lancet retracted, I think printed a full retraction. even though articles get retracted, they're still out there. They still exist in the world, especially in the age of the internet, and they continue to be cited and held up by people as evidence. There are plenty of people who strongly believe in the anti-vaccination movement who don't believe that Andrew Wakefield forged his data, that believe everything that came out of his mouth. So just because the retraction was issued, there are still people that don't believe that retraction due to their own biases, right? Finally, there's harm to the public, and this is again a really good example of Andrew Wakefield's influence. The anti-vaccination movement is the par excellence example of the harm to the public through errors in research. Popular media reporting the results of poor research, not even just fully forged research or erroneous research itself, research that is poorly conducted, that is not held up to the standards of scientific rigor that it should be. It goes out into the world, and it doesn't just influence other researchers. It gets reported upon in secondary sources, and sometimes it goes on to affect policy, right? Laws, and it certainly can have a really negative impact on the public if it's out there and it's not corrected. So what are the sources of culpable error? So we talked about blameless error, innocent mistakes. Let's talk for a moment about people that commit error that we should consider them culpable for. Now, first and foremost, incompetence. If you lack the willingness or the skill set to design an internally valid study, that's an important way that you're introducing error into the world. You're potentially having harm by conducting research that is not internally valid because you are not able to do so, or you failed to do so. There are a couple other areas, though, we need to consider. There's something called subject matter competence. This is where we not only need to be competent in the design of our research studies, but we also need to be competent in the subject matter that we are studying. You need to have a body of knowledge. You need to have done the work, done the groundwork, reading existing literature in that field and talking to other researchers and studying, whether it's in your education formally in graduate school or continuing to study after you finish school, so that you're formulating research questions that have theoretical value, that have real application to the world. If you engage in trivial or invalid hypotheses, this wastes time, and it potentially wastes the time of your participants, puts them in potential harm for no real reason. It's not justified, and therefore it is unethical. There is also a significant problem with competence in data analysis. We talked about this 2 chapters ago in the ethics of how we apply quantitative data analysis. If you operate in the modern era, it's very simple. Once your data is in a database, and it has to be entered into the database correctly. The database has to be built properly, right? There's all these steps. But let's say you've got the data set. It is very, very easy to click a few buttons, a few mouse strokes here and there, and to run whatever statistical test is built into the package that you're using on your computer. So it requires a very low bar of access, but it can be incompetently applied. It can be applied inappropriately. For example, trying to run certain types of analyses that are not valid. If your data is skewed and you're running a correlation, you're running it invalidly, and you should know better, right? As far as your education is concerned. If you are utilizing these user-friendly software packages, it makes it extremely easy to misapply research data, as I said. And this really leads us then to erroneous conclusions. If you're not competent in the data, it's a tool that you're not trained to use, and therefore it has potential to introduce a lot of error. So that's incompetence. On the other side of the coin, we have negligence, and this is where you're conducting research in a careless fashion. Poor literature review, failing to recognize potential confounds, failure to checking the data for accuracy or describing the data accurately. So if you don't bother to check whether or not your data is skewed, and then you apply certain statistical tests and derive conclusions, you are deriving those conclusions erroneously, and the person is being negligent. They're not doing their due diligence in conducting that type of researchers. And this goes down the line, and this goes down the ladder. If you are the primary researcher or you're the professor conducting research with a team of people, you are responsible for ensuring that your assistants conduct research procedures competently, whether that means you need to train them and then do a lot of checking on the training to have the person show you their degree of competence before they're allowed to gather data, and then following up with them periodically and checking in and saying, are we drifting in our practices, right? Or are we getting loose? Are we not being as rigorous as we were on day one on subject 1,000 or 10,000? So continuing to strive for consistency and strict, rigorous application of the scientific method as studies go on. So let's say that we find a mistake. Let's say we find an error in our um, research, excuse me. As scientists, as researchers, we are obligated to try and correct or report errors in our own work and in the work of others, right? The watchmen are watching themselves. So we are not to suppress findings that contradict our own previously published findings. If we run a study and it flies in the face of the supportive evidence we've found previously, we don't just bury that study. We don't, of course, misrepresent the findings of that study either through a variety of forms of malpractice. If we find mistakes in our previously published findings, we have an obligation to seek a correction or a retraction from the journal. That falls initially on the shoulders of the researcher themselves. But this also applies when you become aware of mistakes in the previously published findings of others as well. So part of our ethical obligation is to go through a series of steps to try and correct that error. If you are dealing with someone that you know or that you don't know, usually the first step is a collegial one. You can approach that person via email or personally and say, hey, I've discovered something here that I'm concerned about. Would you please give it your attention? If that person does not address it or fails to report it or doesn't take it further, then you do have an obligation to go to the journal, to go to the institution, to essentially become a whistleblower so that that erroneous data does not live out there in the world and continue to influence science if possible. We have some professional responsibilities about how we use and apply the research results that we find. Um, Unfortunately, there's lots of examples throughout history of medical and psychological findings being misapplied. Um, First of all, psychological research can be utilized to exploit people. It can manipulate people, it can bring them to harm. It can also benefit the manipulator more than those that are being manipulated. See Andrew Wakefield. The ultimate benefit of the recipients of applied knowledge is also of essential importance. We talked about the idea of justice as a principle. So making sure that the recipients of the applied knowledge are getting some benefit from our research is an ethical standard. Another is that you're wasting resources when you're conducting invalid or erroneous research. Applications derived from an incompetently validated theory, they end up wasting money and resources because the underlying theory is incorrect. So not only your own waste or misapplication of funds, but if you publish that study and it becomes influential, then other people are going to continue down that path, even though it's erroneous. And it can have a ripple effect that can really influence lots and lots of wasted resources. Another way in which we can misapply research results is overgeneralization. Generalizability can become an ethical issue when knowledge derived from research conducted in a very restricted setting is used without the replication required to test its external or ecological validity. So if you find something in a very specific population, it's unethical to then go out and say, well, this applies to all human beings, until you've done the replication or found it's been done in the field, then you have an issue there. The other is a failure to apply research. It can be unethical to not apply research when it's warranted. Failing to provide individuals with available benefits is unethical. It's a violation of the principle of justice. So, if you've got things that are potentially helpful and you're sitting on them instead of publishing them, that in and of itself can be unethical. Or when you see a direct application of your findings and you don't fight for it or you don't push for it, I think that can start to fade into a gray area of being unethical as well. We can influence decision makers as scientists. We play multiple roles in society as scientists. You're the scientist and you're the citizen, right? So it's important to think about how those two things interact. We have, like I said, the potential to influence decision makers through application and support of our scientific findings. Um, Reynolds in 1979 identified 4 roles that are sort of synthesized by this dichotomy, and I think these can be really helpful for us to understand how these work within the world of science. Okay, so you might listen to all 4 of these and think about which one resonates with you, which one fits into your definition of how a scientist should straddle this line between being a scientist and being a citizen. And that is the autonomous investigator, the applied scientist, the societal mentor, and the social activist. These are just titles that Reynolds applied, but we'll get into each of them in detail. So the autonomous investigator, aka the basic researcher, if you go way back to, I believe, the second lecture, we talked about applied versus basic research, right? Applied research is specific, it has application, it's intended to further how we practice within the real world. Basic research is, I just want to understand the relationship between constructs. I'm not really thinking about what this means, I'm just furthering the body of knowledge. So people who resolve this dichotomy through the autonomous investigator model are essentially saying that my roles as scientist and citizen are independent of one another. They argue that the scientist's role is just to generate knowledge without regard for the implication of their findings. Okay, very pure form of it. It's basically saying that there is no overlap of these two things, of scientist and citizen. The applied scientist does research on topics related to social problems, but they essentially say, I leave this to politicians and other policymakers to define these problems and the policy decisions needed to solve them. I'm admitting that I am studying applied problems. I'm not doing basic research. It is applied research, but I feel that my role as a scientist stops at conducting the research. It is up to the people in the world who make decisions about policy to decide whether or not they're going to utilize this research, and if so, how? How do they apply it to actual solutions or policies? The third model of resolving this dichotomy is called the societal mentor. This particular approach to this issue is viewing science as a means of providing information about societal problems. You use scientific methods and empiricism to identify problems and develop effective remedies. This is a very strong science-driven view of it, which says that as a scientist, I do need to engage in the political process. I need to act as a social critic and an advice giver. So I'm not being entirely objective and just presenting my data, but I am then pushing with an opinion that is based on that largely objective data. There are ethical implications for this because you are now deciding to engage, right? You're no longer taking a viewpoint that says that I'm above the fray. It's very difficult to be neutral when you're giving advice. You really have to be very, very mindful that you are accurately presenting the totality of the available data without bias. The societal mentor is still trying to hang on very hard to being as objective as possible, a logical positivist approach of seeing the world. So I am engaging, I am giving advice, I am acting as a critic, I am trying to influence to some degree policymakers, but I am very, very focused on not being biased in what I present. So if I have research that says that these things are related in one way, but there's other research out there that is, I believe, scientifically rigorous, I have an obligation to try and present that available data as well. The fourth way to see this dichotomy between citizen and scientist is what's called the social activist model. The social activist model sees a necessary connection between science and society. It is a more humanistic perspective. It advocates particular solutions to particular social problems based on their personal values. You are embracing, to a certain extent, subjectivity and value-based decision-making. The scientific process is therefore used to justify solutions based on personal values. I may believe something, and the key word there is believe, right? I may have a value that I uphold that is not necessarily derived from evidence, but it might just be how I feel, what I feel is true or right. But then I try to utilize the scientific process and the body of knowledge to support that personal value. You have to be very careful about avoiding or ignoring information that contradicts your personal values. But this is the extreme. I think this is where the citizen is given the paramount intensity in this relationship, in this dichotomy. The citizen becomes paramount over scientists to a certain extent. It does not mean that you are misrepresenting, forging data. It's not that, but it is the idea that values are more important than data. And hopefully, the way that we believe our value is right is because it is supported, because we can find data that supports it. So what are our actual responsibilities as researchers? What, if we want to call ourselves a researcher, if we want to operate in this world of science, what are we ethically obligated to do? First of all, conduct research. If you're a researcher, you need to conduct research. If you're a songwriter, you need to write songs. If you're a singer, you need to sing, right? Whatever it is you do. Um, we may not be responsible for all the implications of our research, but we need to consider the possible uses or misuses of our work. We need to be mindful of what we're looking at and what we're conducting our research about, and whether or not certain findings could potentially have some serious implications for being misapplied or misused. We have an obligation or responsibility to report research. As we said, one of the key principles of science is a publicness, an ability to undergo peer review and evaluation by others. So when we have data, if we have results that could be misused, okay, we have to consider two issues. First of all, do we report it at all? We just said a minute ago, we have an obligation to report all findings, right? However, there may be a situation where the research is potentially harmful. The findings are potentially harmful in a variety of ways. They could affect policy, they could affect society, they could hurt certain individuals, whatever. We hold that finding to a higher standard of validity than more typical benign research. We are going to be extremely strenuous in our skepticism and in our critique of that research. We are going to look especially hard for potential confounds or explanations of that data other than the obvious ones. We have a responsibility, if we do report that data, to clearly spell out the meaning of that research in a way that will then minimize the risk of misinterpretation. So if we do decide to publish it, if we decide that the potential benefits to the body of knowledge outweigh the potential harm, or we feel ethically obligated to report it even though we may not agree with it from a personal value perspective, we then have an obligation to be very careful in how we disseminate it. Findings that could potentially influence public policy, they should be clearly delineate in their report the limitations of their methods, their sample, etc. So that whole section of implications and limitations should be really, really dedicated to being clear and being exhaustive. Because that limits people's ability to misapply your research findings. If they do actively misapply them, you can say, but hey, if you look at the original study, there was a large emphasis on X, Y, and Z. You are not considering that in your presentation of this data. One can argue that we have a responsibility in research for a certain degree of societal mentoring and social activism. When we are advising, if you are called upon as a quote-unquote expert in your field or a scientist in your field to comment on social policy, we have an obligation to base our statements on validated information that is clearly generalizable to the particular context to which it is to be applied. Let's break that down a little bit with an example. If you are called to be interviewed by media, you need to make sure that if you're going to present data that it meets that very high criteria. Am I being asked, does this apply to this situation? Am I overgeneralizing, or is there sufficient evidence to support that? So we have to be very careful in how we disseminate information, especially in the public sphere. Once the research is out there, we have some obligation to monitor how it's being used. We want to know the uses to which our findings are being put and to speak out when it appears it's being misapplied or misrepresented. This applies not only to our own work, but that of others as well. And finally, we are obligated and have a responsibility as scientists, and I would argue as consumers of science as well, to seek and advocate for the application of any potentially beneficial scientific knowledge. If we believe that science is an effective and a useful way of understanding the world, then we need to advocate for it. I'll let that sink in for a moment. If we have faith in empiricism as an approach for understanding the universe, and we think that it gives us more valid information than other ways of knowing, we need to evangelize for it, if you will. Okay? This can take a lot of various forms depending on your own personal values. It can include things like political action in some cases, but it kind of requires you to go back to how you resolve your role as scientist and citizen, so those four sort of subtypes to think about how you go about doing this. But I think we have a general um, encouragement by science to go out and try to get people to utilize scientific findings for the betterment of themselves and our society.